Hello, everybody. My name is Chris Holden, Program Officer in Housing with Rural LISC, and I'm here to provide some introductions to our latest Raising the Roof webinar. It's our quarterly series where we tackle project topics of interest to a lot of our local partners and other folks all around the country. One of the topics that people have brought up with me as I've gotten to know some of my local partners I work with is using 4% tax credits. A lot of rural organizations will apply for 9% credits, which are very generous in the equity they provide, but they find that they don't compete well against larger urban projects. And in most states, because it is a statewide competition, each state gets to set its priorities for how they allocate their tax credits and set up their tax credit competitions. So it tends to be that larger projects serving populations that are larger as well, or located in transportation hubs and so on, tend to score better than projects in rural areas. Um, Many of our local partners have turned to 4% or bond tax credits to get their projects through and continue to serve their communities' affordable rental needs. What we have here, we're going to be challenging the use of these credits, some of the challenges that you find when we use them, and our participants will be providing some great examples on how they got around these challenges and produced really great projects. So we'll first hear from Carla Potts, who's Deputy Director, Housing Development Programs with Northeast Community Action Corporation in Bowling Green, Missouri. Carla will be followed by Daniel Boggs, who's CEO of Greater Greenville Housing and Revitalization Association. Greater Greenville is located in Greenville, Mississippi. And rounding out our panel will be Betsy McGovern-Garcia, Vice President of Self-Help Enterprises in Visalia, California. Yes, without further ado, I'd love to hear from Carla. Take it away, Carla.
Thank you, Chris. And NECAC, as Chris said, we're a community action agency in Bowling Green, Missouri. We're also a rural LISC organization and a NeighborWorks affiliate. So I'm going to give you an example of how we utilize the 4% tax credit. In particular, this project was a HUD 202. Next slide. Mill Pond Senior Housing. We received a 202 capital advance, and I list the amount, and of course found that was not enough to build a 52 unit complex. And we were told several times by HUD to ask them for more money. And we did that and were told there was no more money. So we began to realize that if we're going to build this project, we have to be what all of us are, and that's very creative. And we have to think out of the box, or as Congressman Emanuel Cleaver from Missouri says, we have to color outside the lines. The next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about what we did. So here we are. No more 202. Project is greatly needed. Just like all the projects that we go into, we know how badly people need housing. This is in O'Fallon, Missouri, which is one of our urban counties, the county adjacent to St. Louis County. Great need for senior housing. So what do? So we approached the State Housing Finance Agency, and as all of us do, we told our story. We told our story of the need, we told our story of what we have, and asked them to give us ideas of what we could do. So they gave us 3.5 million in tax exempt bonds. They also gave us 4% federal and state low income housing tax credits. Plus we had HUD's 202 funding. So we're ready to go. And it's kind of like the rest of the story. We're ready to go. We have the great need. We have money. We're ready to go. But as all of our stories are, there's always more to the story. And our next slide will tell you the rest of the story. Our project was the first in the nation to use mixed financing for a 202. So brand new. No one had done it before. And it's always great to be a path setter and to, tread new ground. But treading new ground comes with all kinds of barriers, and change is not always as easy as we hope it will be. So we hired a HUD consultant to work with the HUD DC office, who sent a letter to the St. Louis field office saying it was a doable project. Mixed use funding was a good thing. And so we got on one of our multitude of phone calls, and I'll talk about that, and talked about our letter that we were very proud of. And the HUD St. Louis office said, no, they didn't care. That letter didn't matter, and they wanted to continue to look at this project. So after multiple monthly phone calls, and this took over a year to get this deal put together, I will say that probably for all of us, and I know for all of us on this call, on this webinar, we're used to going into this for the long haul. Housing development anywhere is not easy. It is especially not easy sometimes in rural areas that our resources aren't quite as plentiful, but anywhere you are, housing development is not easy. I always tell people if it was easy, everyone would do it. But we are persistent, and we know when there's a great need that we have to hang in there. So we had monthly phone calls with HUD attorney, tax credit attorneys. We had, of course, syndicators involved with this. We had banks involved issuing the bonds. We had the State Housing Finance Agency. So after a year, we had a deal that was acceptable to HUD, and we could break ground. And the next slide, we'll talk about, we thought, well, now we're at closing. How hard? Now we're on the downhill slide. Well, we were on another journey. It took an entire day to close it. We had syndicators on both the West Coast and the East Coast. Had determined that some of the paperwork in the city was not what they want. And so the city, who was a great partner, and we'll talk about partnerships because we all know we don't do this alone. We do this with great partners. They had to bring additional paperwork to HUD to get this closed. But at the end of a very long day, we closed on Mill Pond Senior Housing. And then we went from there. And now to our partners. Who were our partners? Well, we had a lot of partners, and the next slide we'll talk about that. As this was a very long journey, we were a year getting it to a closing. We were a year before that getting the final realization that HUD was not going to have more money, regardless of how many times we asked, and that we had to do something else. So 2 years we spent trying to bring this project to fruition. So in that 2 years, we had amazing partnerships who never left us, who were always there no matter what roadblock loomed in our pathway. They were there. The city of O'Fallon, the Missouri Housing Development Commission, who is the state housing finance agency for Missouri, the Missouri Department of Economic Development, U.S. Bank, WNC, Dublin Capital, and those two were the syndicators. And then, of course, HUD, the HUD field office and the HUD national office, who knew they were paving new ground with mixed use financing and using 4% tax credits on a 202 that had never been done before. So they they worked with us, regardless of what happened. We were back at the table, the next week talking to see what we could do. All of us knew how important this was. I will tell you that when we broke ground, it was in January, and the high temperature that day in Missouri was like zero. Our contractor brought in a backhoe to did enough dirt to be able to put shovels into the ground. So weather-wise, it wasn't the best weather, but I can tell you there was so much enthusiasm with everyone that was there about we did it. We're going to break ground and we're going to build 52 senior apartments. So where are we today? And the next slide will show you the picture. That's Mill Pond Apartments. 52 senior units. They're one bedroom because they are still 202. They have stayed 100% full. We have some tenants in there almost from the beginning, not as many, but some. And it is a beautiful project. Our syndicator who comes out to visit will say it looks like it looked the day that we, did the ribbon cutting and opened it up. And we believe that too. We're very proud of it. So this is kind of a real life example of using 4%. The other presenters will give you that too. Can it happen? Absolutely, it can. Can it make a deal work? Absolutely. We weren't going to get 9%. The competitive nature, and besides, when we knew we didn't have enough money, the 9% round was done, and we would have had to wait for almost another year to be able to submit. So 4% works. 4% made this deal happen that would not have happened. And 52 units and 52 seniors will tell you how important it was that we persevered and didn't give up, because that's not who we are as developers. And the final slide will just give you information about how to contact me. I'm more than happy to talk to anyone about the project, more than happy to talk to you about how we use the 4% and, the hurdles and the good things and the bad things, and then how to utilize them with a HUD 202 if you're doing a HUD 202. So I'm going to stop there and give it back to Chris.
Thanks a lot, Carla. That is fascinating. And wow, what a beautiful project. Uh, Next time, we're going to hear from Daniel Boggs from Greater Greenville. And we're going to definitely get more 4% nuggets of wisdom, but certainly different perspective because he's talking about a very different project in a very different state. So, with that in mind, thanks a lot, Daniel. Take it away.
Thanks, Chris. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank the Rule List team for giving me the opportunity to speak today. So 5 years ago, I was in the same position as many of you probably are now, wondering how can we get projects to pencil out, facing rising construction costs, and those rising costs occurred because of the pandemic. And what we saw, because we love to track numbers, that those costs increased, upwards of about 42%. They have kind of come down a little bit, but they still very much are escalated. So, that question, that burning question, led us to explore the low income housing tax credit program, specifically the 4% credits. And as Carla reiterated, yes, we always need more money because of these rising costs. But where does that extra money come from? And why do we need that more money? So, instead of really talking about a project for me, I'm going to kind of delve into kind of the experiences, the challenges, the lessons learned that we've had, and really try to justify why we have those extra costs now, which requires such deep subsidy and such layering of capital to make a project in a rural community work. So next slide, who is Greater Greenville? Um, we are a nonprofit organization operating in the Mississippi Delta, arguably the poorest region of the United States. We're actually two nonprofit organizations working under one roof. The first one is Greater Greenville Housing, which was formed in 1992. Our sister company, which is also the parent to Main Street Greenville, is the Greater Greenville Development Foundation that was formed in 1990. They do a lot more small-scale economic development, community revitalization type projects. Things like the Delta Hot Tamale Festival, which actually got voted as the best specialty food festival in the nation by USA Today last year. And this division of our organization actually also owns and operates a small 36-room boutique historic hotel in our downtown community, which is just an economic developer for us as far as hospitality to one of the most hospitable states in the nation. But I do want to thank Rural List, their support, their guidance, their technical assistance, capacity grants, Section 4 funding, educational sessions such as this have really helped increase the capacity of our organization over the past decade, actually a little bit more. Whenever I was hired in 2012, we were an office of 2, and today we're actually an office of 23. So Rural List has been a huge supporter in our initiatives in our community, and also trying to make it a better place to live. So next slide. So this is a little graph of, inhibitors of applying for and obtaining 9% credit. So, here are some of the common barriers of why smaller organizations, especially in rural communities, do not apply for 9% credits. Now, I'm going to speak specifically to me. You can kind of read what those bullet points are. But for us, our organization, we really just couldn't score well in the QAP. As Chris said earlier, the state controls the scoring. And no matter how we modified our project, skinned the cat per se, we never really could get to what that implied minimum score is. And I say implied because they're never going to tell you what the minimum score is to get a 9% allocation. But, there's some buzzing going around in the community. Everybody kind of tells you that you need to be, 125, 130. And, whenever we kind of just looked and flipped our project over a couple of times, we just realized we were never going to get to that point. The second thing was capacity. As I said earlier, we were a very small nonprofit organization. We have grown. We have grown in capacity. We've grown in size. But we just did not have the in-house capacity pre-COVID to really make a good push for the 9% credits. We looked at also partnering with other organizations that had the capacity. But, that just was not beneficial to us, a community that's really, community first philosophy. One of the developers told me, hey, look, I'll help you out, but I'm going to take 100% of the developer fee. Another one basically said, stay out of the way. I'll give you the keys at the end. And again, for us, that just really didn't fit because we're the ones that are in this community. We're the ones maintaining it. We're the ones marketing it. So if you ever decide to partner with somebody to get those capacity reports, make sure that your voice is heard. Make sure that you're at the table because it's your community. You're the one who's fighting to put the houses on the ground. And your opinion matters just as much as that person that has the capacity as well. So last but not least for us is obviously also the risk versus the cost. There's a lot of upfront costs that go into applying for 9%. So there's a lot of upfront costs that go into applying for 4% credits as well. But you got all the engineering, all the architecture, all the surveying, all the environmental asbestos work. That's a lot of upfront costs for a maybe. And I would say even a maybe is not even a high percentage thing. 9% are very competitive. If I'm going to invest that amount of money into all of this pre-development work, I really want a fighting chance to get an allocation. So again, that's why we kind of just said, okay, we're not going to go after the 9%. So we're going to go after the 4%. 9% is kind of give you 70% of your revenue needed. The 4% give you more of about 30%. So you do have to kind of stack behind that. But again, if I'm going to spend that money, I want to go something that's a little bit more competitive route. That's kind of my nature. Next slide. So why is layering needed? And you can see right here, according to the slide, I'm having trouble reading it, but you can see the National Low Income Housing Coalition estimates a current shortfall of approximately $7.1 million of affordable rental housing homes for extremely low income households. That's nationwide. And then, of course, to the Rural Housing Coalition, construction in rural communities, non-metro, has fallen dramatically from about 221,000 homes per year between 1999, I believe. I'm having a hard time seeing. I'm just now wearing glasses. To 2008, just 68,000 per year from 2009 to 2017. So as you see from the graph to the right, the blue and the green, the need for affordable housing is growing. There's a lot of statistics that support that basically say that households are actually getting poorer. And then there's a lot of people that just aren't developing in the rural communities. And you can see from the map that's right beside it, rural areas versus non-rural areas, so urban areas. So there is a large sea out there of rural places that desperately need affordable housing. But why are we not having the construction costs? So we'll go ahead and jump to the next slide. Why is nobody building in rural communities? Well, this is a side-by-side performa of a rural development project and an urban development project. So again, if you look at the numbers, rural projects versus urban projects, I would probably say the scale of these projects are probably pretty good for its location. If you build 40 units in a rural community, that's a pretty sizable development. If you build 100 in an urban, that's a pretty sizable development as well. So let's go ahead and just, you know, acknowledge the elephant in the room. Building materials really do not cost any more between urban communities and rural communities. If I buy a 2x4 in Greenville, Mississippi, the cost of it in an urban community is not going to be extremely that much higher in an urban community. So cost of construction in rural versus urban, there's not really much difference there. Also, your operating cost. It really doesn't cost any more to manage and operate that building or maintain that building or that unit as it does in rural. So what's the difference? So the difference is the scale and the revenue. As you can see, the average rent for a rural community, this is for a 2-bedroom unit, is $560 per year, whereas the rent for an urban community for the same 2-bedroom is $1,050. So you kind of work your way down. You kind of see, you know, okay, $560 times 40 units, what it kind of scales out to be. If you see the net operating income at the bottom, you can definitely see in a rural community, a sizable project's only going to net you about $68,000, but in an urban community, it's going to net you, you know, almost $750,000. So that's why we're seeing a lot of these private investors go more to urban communities. I can specifically say in Greenville, Mississippi, we have not seen a significant investment from private investors in the last 30 years, which, you know, again, absolutely affects us across the scales. So next one, I'm going to dive into it just a little bit more. This is one of the issues that we've also had, and I've served on some panels and discussions and boards, and we've had this conversation over and over and over, and depending on where you are, this may be a little bit different, but these numbers were derived basically from standard rule numbers across the nation, the green that you saw on the map before. But if you're going to develop a affordable housing project in rural America and you build, and the construction cost, hard cost and soft cost, are $6.6 million, on average, it's going to appraise after construction for $4.2 million, which leaves a gap of $2.4 million that you need to fill. Now, ironically, that's about that 35%, which can be backfilled by the 4% credits. So it kind of works out that way. However, in Mississippi, in the deep delta, we've seen numbers even more dramatically than that. For example, in 2018, we built an apartment complex called Ed Gray Park. It was a trend-setting development. It actually capitalized on natural elements of the environment to reduce energy cost, but that development was $6.2 million. The post-construction appraisal, if it was a market rate development, would have appraised at $3.9 million. However, and this is the big however that we always face as affordable housing developers, is that with the deed restrictions basically having the long-term affordability periods of 50 and 60% AMI, that project, $6.2 million, only appraised for 1.9 with the rent restrictions attached to it. So again, that's a huge deterrent. I mean, you're losing 66, 67, 68 cents on the dollar for a development in rural communities. So the next one, and this is one of my last ones, again, it just kind of very graphic picture. This is my Lady Justice, little shout out to ChatGTP to kind of reiterate that image. I just put that image in and spit that thing out. So now I don't have to look for clip arts to do my PowerPoint presentations anymore. But anyway, this is kind of just nailing that, driving that nail home a little bit more. So I'm going to kind of show this to you, and hopefully this shows why we need such deep subsidy in rural communities. So this is my Lady of Justice. It's a visual summary of the math mismatch that we have in communities. So in rural America, the cost to build and operate a 2-bedroom unit. Now, I'm going to say it's a large 2-bedroom, but understand that I kept the numbers very simple just so we can easily understand it. But 1,000 square foot 2-bedroom unit is going to run you principal and interest $1,491 a month. And whenever you throw that number out there, there's absolutely no way that that can happen. But let's break it down. So that's 1,000 square feet. Again, it's a large 2-bedroom. At $150 a square foot. And I would say $150 is not unreasonable. I actually just spoke with a friend of mine not too long ago from the Mississippi Gulf Coast. He's a very efficient developer. He's building right now for about $145 a square foot. But you equate $150 a square foot, simple math, 1,000 square feet, that's a $150,000 loan over a 20-year period. So I gave you as much loan as I think a typical community bank would do. I know that we bank with a lot of big banks, and they give us 20 years, but at 6% interest, those numbers equate to $1,074 a month P&I. And then you throw in the $5,000 per year in operating costs, which goes back to the pro forma from a couple of slides ago. That's an additional $417 to cover your maintenance, your overhead, your insurance, your utilities. So again, these numbers are not very unreasonable. So again, to build, operate, and manage a 2-bedroom in rural communities right now is $1,491, give or take. We can argue on some dollars here and there, but the average rent is $560. That just does not pencil out. So that means specifically with this example, we're right at about 65% of the cost has to be subsidized. So what's the easiest way for us to get there? Our story is the 4% tax credits. Again, it's a low-hanging fruit. We do couple that with some Federal Home Loan Bank dollars and some CHOTO dollars. We are a CHOTO organization as well, so some home dollars. And I know that in some other communities, they're able to access CDBG. In Mississippi, we're not. CDBG is only used for infrastructure in the state of Mississippi, so we are not able to capitalize on it. But this has been able to help fill a substantial gap, as demonstrated in these previous slides, of why we need 4% credits to actually make the project happen. Now, if you want to chase the 9%, I've heard a lot of developers say that they've chased credits for 3, 4, 5, 6 years. If you can afford to chase them, the financial benefit of it is worth it. But for us in the Mississippi Delta, where we've had impact studies that say we need 2,000 more units ASAP by tomorrow, we simply just can't wait for the 9%. 4% are easy. You can go get them. You apply for them, 90 days to close. You have your funding ready and you can move on. And then again, you just kind of have to be creative on the backfilling it the other way. But 30% of your costs are kind of taken for. So I think this is the last slide. Thank you again for your time. I hope it gave you a clear picture. This is this is one more thing. This is a side-by-side. I'm sorry. Key benefits of using 4% credits. To the left, you see the challenges, the goals with the 9%. On the other side, you have the advantages of using 4%. Again, with everything that I've said, 4% right now makes it easier for us. We may make a go at 9% later, but right now we're really cruising along at 4%, meeting the needs of our community, and very happy to be able to use this wonderful tool to keep providing affordable housing to an extremely low-income community. So thank you again. I hope it gave you a clear picture of the challenges we faced, how we navigate them, implementing 4% credits to meet our needs. And I'm going to hang around. I think we got one more presenter, but if there's any questions at the end, I'd be more than happy to take them.
Wow, terrific. Thank you, Daniel. That was, I loved how you really highlighted the difference between, the revenues and the costs. And valuation is something I ran into a lot when I was working in Northern Vermont. Appraisal's not meeting my actual cost to build.
Right.
So really excellent presentation. And before we start with our last presenter, I do want to note that we will have a little bit of time at the end, and we'll try to pull out a couple of questions if people have them. So if you do have questions directed for either Daniel or Carla, or as we go along through Betsy's presentation, please put them in the Q&A section, and India will help us pick one or two for the panelists to consider at the end. So anyway, thank you very much. And Betsy, looking forward to what you've got to share.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chris. Good afternoon, everyone. As was mentioned, my name is Betsy McGovern-Garcia. I'm the Vice President of Self-Help Enterprises, and we work in the San Joaquin Valley of California, which is generally Bakersfield on the south end up to Stockton on the north end in San Joaquin County. A little bit about our organization. We have been around for over 60 years. We started in 1965 when a group of 3 farm worker families wanted to improve their housing conditions. We pioneered the mutual self-help housing method of construction, where our families work in groups of 9 to 11 to build their own homes. They work 40 hours a week over the construction period, which is typically 10 to 12 months. And then that labor is contributed towards the cost of the home in the form of sweat equity and helps to make the homeownership opportunity affordable for the family. We've built over 6,600 units through this method of construction. We are also an active rental housing builder, owner, developer, operator. We currently have over 3,000 units of rental housing. At any given time, we usually have about 250 to 400 under construction. That's typically a combination of 4% and 9% low-income housing tax credit deals. We're also active in preservation, acquiring housing and renovating and preserving housing to retain affordability. And then also we have active water and wastewater and emergency services programs. So water delivery, new water wells, clean drinking water in schools, consolidation of small rural districts. And through all of these programs, we work intensely with Rural LIHTC. We are also a Section 4 grantee. Really appreciate their support and their expertise as we move forward these impacts to our communities. So a little bit about the differences between 4% and 9%. I'm going to focus on some of kind of the technical differences. As I mentioned, we have a pre-development pipeline, usually have multiple projects under development. We have many of our projects where we will pursue 4% and 9% credits. Daniel referenced this, but it really depends on the state that you're working in and what the environment is for competitiveness within your programs. Our 9% program is very competitive. It's oversubscribed to the tune of 10 to 1 on average. And currently, because of the rising costs of projects, the state of California is really only funding 3 to 5 rural projects around. And so 3 projects around, 2 rounds a year. We're only getting 6 rural projects, 6 to 10 rural projects funded in the 9% competition. So then we look at the 4% competition. 4% competition requires more secondary subsidy to be viable. And it depends if your state is oversubscribed in the tax exempt bond allocation area, because 4% credits have to be paired with bonds. The state of California hit that threshold probably around 2018, 2019. And so our 4% program is no longer over the counter. It used to be that we could get all of our money ready to go and then go in for 4% credits. And it sounds like Mississippi within 90 days be ready to close. But now it's competitive. So we're competing for those credits just like we're competing for 9% credits, and it is not anymore guaranteed. So the thing you want to know, the applicable percentage rate in the 9% program, obviously that's 9%. So you're taking 9% times your eligible basis for a period of 10 years, which is the tax credit delivery period. Whereas the applicable percentage in the 4% is 4. So you're getting less than half the equity yield off your eligible basis. That varies depending on if you're in a QCT or a DDA, and there's some other nuances per state, but generally you're yielding less equity with a 4% application. As I mentioned, the 4% program needs to be paired with tax exempt bonds. So if your tax exempt bonds are competitive in your state, you need to evaluate that. You're going to get more equity in 9s. 4% requires a TEFRA hearing, which I'll talk about. The 9% program, you have to do a carryover, and there's a 10% test. Also in the 9%, you have to place in service within 2 years of the deadline. So depending on the complexity of your project, that's a consideration. And then 4% projects are just inherently more complex with more attorneys. You're issuing tax exempt bonds. You've got more hands in the cookie jar working on the transaction, so that should be considered. 4% did just get locked in 2021. I say just 2021, that's a couple of years ago now, but in the affordable housing development world, you blink and several years goes by. So that is kind of a new-ish thing within the 4% program. Used to fluctuate from 3.1 to 3.8%. You never really knew what your applicable rate was. So tax exempt bonds, I talked a little bit about this, 4% credits. Used to be that you needed 50% of your project financed through tax exempt bonds. What that means is you issue tax exempt bonds typically through an issuer. An issuer can be in the state of California. There's a JPA, Joint Powers Agreement, that is a bond issuer. They obtain their authority via resolution assigning it from the city or county. Public agencies, cities, and counties can be bond issuers, and housing authorities can issue bonds. So just recently in the BBB, they authorized reducing the 50% to 25%. So now you just need bond financing for 25% of your project costs. That is significant in a state where you're meeting your tax exempt bond cap, because you effectively double the amount of projects that you can utilize 4% federal credits, because you only have to allocate 25% of the costs via bonds instead of 50%. So if you're in a state that is oversubscribed for bonds, your state should be writing emergency regulations currently. The 25% test goes into effect January 1. We have projects in California. We have one that was funded first round, which would have been April 8th, with a readiness deadline of October, and we are considering electively pushing that into 2026 so that we can follow the 25% test. So if you have projects in the pipeline and your bonds are competitive, you want to know what your state's doing with the 25% test. Next slide, please. Scoring considerations, every state has different scoring criteria. The scoring criteria can be found in the qualified allocation plan for the state that you are working in. In our state, the 9% tiebreaker, everyone scores perfect in the competition. The tiebreaker is a function of leveraged funds. So how much soft second funds you have compared to the 9% equity. We had one rural project recently where our tiebreaker was 87%, roughly meaning that 87% of our funding was coming from secondary funds. We could have put in as a 4% at that ratio, but that's what it took to win the rural competition in California. Versus the 4% competition, there's a multitude of factors that go into the tiebreaker formula: rent savings, special needs, sustainability, opportunity mapping. California has high opportunity maps to affirmatively further fair housing. So depending on what your score is on those maps, that influences the tiebreaker. 9% tends to have deeper income targeting, more flexibility in the 4%. And then there are other factors like site amenities, density, and infill. Next slide, please. So I talked about placed in service only applies in the 9% program. This is codified in IRS code. So if you have 9% credits allocated in 2024, you must place your buildings in service by December of 2026. And I have to stop and highlight the pictures at the bottom of this slide. These are photos from River Grove, which is a project I'm going to talk about in rural Madera County and Oakhurst on the way to Yosemite. We had to drill down 30-foot foundational piers because we were adjacent to a creek. So here's some screenshots from construction, and it's just representative of some of the challenges building in rural communities, especially when you're in the foothills or mountains and have topography challenges. Next slide. So TEFRA, I mentioned TEFRA, the issuance of tax exempt bonds requires a TEFRA hearing. No one ever knows what TEFRA stands for, but I put it on here in case anyone is curious. Tax Equity and Fiscal Responsibility Act. It is required to have a public hearing prior to the issuance of tax exempt bonds. These used to be kind of, over the counter, run of the mill hearings that the city or the county or the issuer would conduct. They're typically facilitated and noticed by the bond issuer. This has become a big issue in California and probably other states with a lot of NIMBY challenges. Now during TEFRA hearings, they're being challenged by labor unions and other NIMBYs to stop projects. So if the city doesn't authorize the TEFRA resolution, which basically doesn't say anything other than certifying the fact that they held a public hearing, cities can deny adoption of that TEFRA resolution, and it could effectively limit or impede your ability to use tax exempt bonds, which then means you can't access 4% low-income housing tax credits because you have to now meet the 25% test. So pay attention to your TEFRA hearing, especially if you're in a very challenging community with a lot of NIMBYs or challenges from labor unions and other workforce entities. Next slide, please. Capital accounts, you're getting less equity off of a 4% deal. Generally, a capital account represents the amount of investment that your limited partner puts in tax credit equity. Your investors' benefit cannot exceed their investment. The benefit not only includes the actual tax credits that they're taking, but it also includes accumulating interests and losses and depreciation. So if you have a lot of deferred debt, say you have state loans at 3%, that 3% is accumulating on the books of the limited partnership. Those are losses, which are benefits that flow through to your investor. They're depleting the capital account. And we've had several, I would say 90% of our 4% transactions have capital account issues, which means that you then need to generate minimum gain, or you need to reallocate losses to your general partner to solve the capital accounts. So pay attention to capital accounts in your 4% transactions. Next slide, please. So I mentioned River Grove. This is an aerial, site plan and aerial of our River Grove project in Oakhurst, right outside the gates of Yosemite and Madera County. You can see from the aerial, it's a 3-story product. We built this over 2 phases. Phase 1 was a 9% transaction and phase 2 was a 4% transaction. So it provides a good point of comparison. Next slide, please. River Grove 1, the 9% transaction. Here's just a snapshot of our financing. 70 units, so it was the larger phase. In total, the project's 121 units. 40 million in total development cost. We had 12.8 million of soft financing. So you can see here that was No Place Like Home funding, which is funding for permanent supportive housing in California. Permanent local housing allocation, also state funds, and then some capital magnet funds from a regional CDFI. And that soft financing represented 32% of the total cost of the project. Equity here is 65%, so larger equity yield on a 9% transaction. Next slide, please. And then the 4% River Grove 2, we just closed this financing in the first week of July and are now under construction. Total of 50 units, TDC 32.7 million. We had a lot of soft financing here, 23 million. The bulk of that is home and home ARP from the state of California, and then some National Housing Trust Fund funding, which is also a federally sourced funding source, and infill infrastructure grant, which is a straight state funding program. In this scenario, 70% of our funding is soft financing and only 30% is equity. So it works really well as a 4% transaction. The other thing that folks should consider is that on a 4% transaction, usually your equity pricing, your tax credit pricing is lower. So we just took projects out to market, and we're sitting at about 86 cents on 4% transactions. If we're lucky, 84, 86 cents, and probably around 88 to 89 cents for 9% credits. With the reduction of the 50% test to 25%, more projects are going to be viable, which means more tax credit equity is flooding the market. So we're also anticipating a softening in tax credit equity pricing, which may mean that deals in the pipeline have gaps suddenly, because maybe before we projected 91 cents and we're down to 84 cents. So be conscious of your markets and where your pricing is. And if your bonds were competitive and they're not now because of the 25% test, that is going to impact your pricing. And that is the end of my presentation. And so, Chris, I'll turn it back to you. And I think we're opening it for Q&A.
Yes, we are, and we've already got a few questions lined up in the queue here. Some of them are more business focused, as it were. Someone did ask, will we get a copy of the slides? Traditionally, we have posted the webinar to our website. I think we've posted it to YouTube in the past as well. But we will let everybody know when we do post it, where it can be found, and you can view it again. Anyway, I wanted to probably direct a couple of these questions are directed to specific presenters. And let's start with one here. Asking Daniel how he works the tax-exempt bond financing into his 4% deals and how much time and complexity does it add? Daniel, can you speak to that?
Oh, you're on
I
mute.
think you're on mute.
Yep.
Wow, I just said a lot of really profound words. So hate you guys missed that. Sorry. No, the complexity of the projects are difficult. The one that we're working on right now specifically is a downtown revitalization initiative. It's actually a mix of historic tax credits, state and federal, some low-income housing tax credits, 4%, some new market tax credits, state and federal, some charter funds, and also some private financing. So, getting that capital stack, what is that? Probably about 6 or 7 different pieces of financing just to make this project work. That's not unreasonable for us. The last project that I spoke about, the one that we did, the 42 units, that was 6.2 million and only priced for 1.9. That was 9 different sources of funding. But whenever you start getting into the bond deals, whenever you start getting into the tax credits, I'm starting to figure it out also through the new market tax credits. It's very difficult in regards to timing, because I think as Betsy said, with the 9%, you have to close it within 2 years, which is why you have to do all the upfront work. 4% are, I think, a little bit more flexible to stack with other sources of capital. But it is very difficult, and it is all about timing. And it's difficult, but again, for us, it's necessary, because without those multiple sources of financing, our project just is not feasible. It used to be where we could do a CHOTO grant, some Federal Home Loan Bank dollars. We're part of the Federal Home Loan Bank of Dallas. But we would do a CHOTO grant, a Federal Home Loan Bank of Dallas, and just a small private loan. And that's just not the case anymore, especially with the rising costs. So, yeah, it's very cumbersome. It's very tedious. But again, it's necessary.
Thanks a lot, Daniel. I do have another question here that maybe feel free, any panelist, to jump in. but how much are fees increased for a 4% project versus a 9% deal? I'm going to just start with just a quick recollection of a project I did, a 4% deal in Northern Vermont. I think part of the thing with 4% is you do have to, it only gives you your 30% of your total cost. And so I would be using other sources that required a lot of a lot of legal scholars and a lot of accountants and so on. So like historic tax credits, for instance. So I do think that because you have to tackle a lot more sources, weave a lot more sources into the deal probably as part of it. But certainly let any of you answer the question.
Yeah, definitely. You're going to have additional legal counsel for your issuer. You're going to have a tax opinion and counsel for the tax exempt bonds. So that would probably add for us in California an additional $75,000 to $150,000 to the transaction. There is also an operating impact. The tax exempt bonds come with a regulatory agreement. I think in California, the term of that regulatory agreement matches the tax credits, which is 55 years. And there is a monitoring fee because the issuer has to monitor that annually. For us, it's about $4,000 a year, which some could say is de minimis, but for our rural deals that barely pencil to begin with, $4,000 sometimes is enough to tip us over the edge of being negative. We will sometimes capitalize that up front and prepay the issuer fee if we have access to additional development capital. So we'll, the first 20 years of that or whatever the term is, we'll lump sum pay that up front or put it into a reserve, which is a strategy for covering that issuer fee. So it is slightly more expensive to do it. But if it's a pathway forward that makes your project feasible in an environment where 9% are not feasible, it is absolutely worth it.
Definitely a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush kind of situation.
Yeah, and I would definitely just add to that is definitely make sure you know of every aspect or every detail of that deal. It can become a little bit more difficult. You have to time it. You have to understand what those costs are going to be. They're definitely covered up with accountants and attorneys. Everybody's represented. So whenever you get to closing, you want to close fast and quickly. So again, understand what all those costs are going to be and work out a path to streamline the process.
All right. I think we've got a couple more questions here, but I can definitely get one in. We had someone ask if we could talk a bit more about the 50% test versus the 25% test from the One Big Beautiful Bill. More specifically, and I think this is where I think I've read and heard a lot of different things, is how to understand how this new 25% test will impact rural projects and rural communities in particular. Anyone?
Yeah, I can take that. So the main area where it impacts rural projects is in the rent differential or the interest differential between a taxable construction loan and a construction loan funded with tax exempt bonds. So the benefit of tax exempt bonds and the theory behind pairing 4% federal credits with tax exempt bonds is that they're tax exempt, so you get a better interest rate. We're seeing about 90 basis points, which is 0.9% of a benefit in the interest on the construction loan. Sometimes when the interest rate fluctuates, interest rates are real high. We might see as much as 1.5% to 2% differential on a construction loan funded with tax exempt bonds versus a traditional construction loan. And so it really is how much of the construction loan is sourced from tax exempt bonds, because you tend to get a better interest rate. And so you have interest savings. We have a project that's closing in October where we went through this exercise today, actually, and the amount of interest savings that we will be able to experience by reducing our bond construction loan, our tax exempt construction loan. Ours is a little different because we're using deferred money because we were able to bring in some more money. But in a nutshell, ours is the opposite. We're actually saving money because we're reducing our loan. We've had projects that have had state funding that has 0 interest that we could have used during construction, but because you have to have 50% of your project covered with tax exempt bonds, we were forced to use a construction loan. So it creates a lot more flexibility, but it can also cause an increase in interest if you're going from a tax exempt to a taxable. So you really just have to look at, sorry, that was a whole loaded answer. You really have to just look at your construction sources and what your interest rates are, because where you see it, the cost impact is in the interest rates.
Very detailed though, Betsy. Hit the nail on the head.
Go down a rabbit hole.
Any other perspectives? I mean, the thinking behind it obviously is that, you can, states do, more and more states are running up against their bond cap limits, and it allows states to stretch some of these bond dollars to serve more projects around the state. So that's sort of just a basic kind of thing there. I think it does potentially allow not only interest rate savings, as Betsy was pointing out, but it does potentially allow you to find out other sources to secure that might not be as expensive as the bond financing. So, but that's definitely a state by state kind of thing.
And Chris, there's also benefit when you have a lower threshold. If the cost of your project increases, it's easier to meet the 25% test instead of the 50% test. We've had projects where we've uncovered site conditions that have added $1 million to the cost of the project. And then you need a supplemental bond allocation because you have to cover 50% of that with bonds. And so it gives a little bit more flexibility because that bond threshold now is 25%. So
That's
it's a
good.
good thing. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have the feeling it is a good thing. So I was but I didn't want to sound, well, I had some experts here. I wanted to sound you all out while I could. We're pretty much near the end of our time for the podcast. I really appreciate all of your help and sharing your expertise and talking about your projects. And I hope that the audience was able to get something out of the Q&A. I know we didn't address only about half of the questions that people had. And we will definitely let everybody know who's registered for the webinar when we have it available for posting, and you can download it. So thank you again, and let's keep raising the roof.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.